All right, here we start with Impressionism Part 2, and the first artist that we're going to look at is Pierre-Auguste Renoir. I'm going to apologize here for a moment before we start this slideshow. The recording technology that I'm using allows me to just go through all the slides at once and hit it all at once and get it right just once. So if you find me coughing or flubbing a line along the way, sorry, I don't want to re-record half an hour's worth of lecture. So, Renoir, Frenchman, lives until 1919, nearly as long as Monet. He refused to use black. He said it's not a color. He often cropped his figures, suggesting that the scene expanded beyond the painting. That's a technique and an idea that will be embraced by the abstract expressionists in America in the 1940s. The dominant theme for Renoir was nudes, and toward the end of his life, he suffered from arthritis, and it was so severe that it forced him to paint with brushes strapped to his, and the words missing there, wrists. You've really got to want to paint to go to those extremes to make your work. Most of the artists that we look at here are driven to make art. It's not that they couldn't do anything else, it's that they couldn't see themselves doing anything else. It's a calling. Now we see the La Grenouillère that we looked at by Monet before, up in the top left corner of your screen. And we see the same theme now, painted on the right by Renoir. A lot of these artists would go out together and paint the same scene and kind of play off each other and see what one another would do. The compositions here are virtually identical. Very different, however, use of color. And I would also urge you to look at the brushstrokes. The brushstrokes are very different. Renoir's brushstrokes in his landscapes seem to me to be kind of wispy. And where Monet worked blues and yellows against one another in his painting, Renoir works reds and oranges against one another. Again, close, but not quite, plays of complementary colors. Which one do you prefer? That's a decision you'll have to make on your own. I think I've got to stick with Monet in this case. This is The Umbrellas from 1879 by Renoir. And if you look closely at some of the dark colors in this painting, you'll see that they really are blue or purple or green. There's really no pure black found in the Renoir painting. Great pattern in the top part of the painting with the umbrellas repeating one after another after another. It's an odd painting in that there's a crowd, and yet the little girl and the woman with the basket on the left are both pretty engaged with the viewer, looking right out at us. This is the Luncheon of the Boating Party, painted in 1881. It's the subject of a recent historical novel that writes about the painting from the perspective, really, of each of the people involved in the painting. And it's a fascinating look into late 19th century France. And you get the impression, that the Impressionists were not so down and dirty as the realists were, and that may very well be true. It's not the richest slice of life, but it's certainly people enjoying themselves on a Sunday afternoon here in Renoir's painting. You look at the beautiful young woman to the left, in the bottom left of the painting, you can just almost hear her doing baby talk with her dog there sitting on the table. Certainly it looks like everybody's having a good time, and Renoir is trying to give the impression of a joyful occasion, a party. Now this is Nude in Sunlight by Renoir. I don't have a date on this one, but the comment that a lot of critics threw at Renoir when he exhibited paintings like this was that it looks not so much like real flesh, but rotting flesh because of the colors that were on the skin. Well, you know, if you stand next to a green tree, you're going to pick up some of that green. If you're near the sky on the horizon, you're going to pick up some of the blue. If you stand next to a blue wall, some of that's going to be reflected in your skin tone. And these are all things that Renoir was observing and putting down in his painting here. Edgar Degas, another French artist, lived until 1917, so we're discovering that many of the Impressionists lived quite a while. Now, he was quite different from Monet in that he detested painting out of doors. He said art is not a sport. He felt that was too much of a challenge to go out and paint in that way. Now, he was influenced by Japanese prints and by the French neoclassic painter Ingres, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who advised him to draw many lines. Then the 1870s saw Degas' eyesight begin to fail, and he started to do a lot of pastels with really bright colors, and he also started to do sculpture, and we'll look at his sculpture in another slideshow. Primary subjects for Degas included ballet, among numerous other topics. This is Degas' The Glass of Absinthe, or the Absinthe Drinker. And it's really great the way he uses diagonals in this painting, starting at the very bottom, moving off to the left, coming into the table that shoots across to the right, and takes you to that woman who is just stoned out of her gourd from drinking the absinthe. The guy off to the right appears to be smoking a pipe, doesn't seem to care a whole lot about her. She doesn't seem to care a whole lot about anything, least of all herself at this point in this painting. But it's a challenging and a dynamic composition, and Degas loved to employ diagonals in many of his paintings. This is The Milliner's Shop, another oil painting by Degas that I think has great pattern in it, like we saw with the umbrellas by Renoir earlier, and great color in all of these hats, the blues, the greens, the reds, the whites, the ochres. The woman in here is almost an afterthought, isn't she? She just barely pops into the composition. It could just almost work without her. If you hold your right hand up and block her out, it's still a fairly successful and engaging painting without the right part of it. So is the subject the woman? Is it the woman at work? Or is it the great hats and the colors and textures it afforded Degas to explore? This is Les Foyers de la Danse, and Degas loved to paint the dance. He loved to paint horse races, many other things, but the dance was a major, major occupation for him. And one thing that I think is really cool in this painting is the chair in the foreground. The chair is cut off by the bottom of the painting, implying that it is sitting halfway in the dance studio space and halfway in our space. It's almost like we can come in, move some things off the chair, sit down there, and experience what's going on in the room. It really is a stand-in, or if you will, a sit-in for us, for the viewer, as we look at this painting. This is another dance class from 1880, or dance studio, that I think is really terrific. You've got that line of dancers that starts on the far left and moves back in space at a diagonal. And what keeps you from just flying off the right side of the canvas but that dance instructor, but the teacher, leaning on his cane? You know, without him in this painting, you've got all that open space on the floor, you've got the diagonal movement of the dancers to the right, and you just fly out of the painting and never look at it again. Here, he keeps you engaged. You start to go back in space. You find your way to him. You find your way back to the dress, say, of the ballerina in the foreground. Then you start to explore what's going on there. The red bow in her hair, the green bow at the back of her dress, the yellow bow at the woman that is to her left. So great little hints of color thrown in here and there, but the man in the painting really helps make the painting work. Couple more paintings by Degas. One on the left is a dance class. The one on the right is the woman combing her hair from 1880 to 1889. I've got these two together not because thematically they belong, but they belong together because of the technique or the media that Degas uses here. These are both pastel drawings. And if you look at the woman's skirt in the image on the left, you'll see that brushstroke, or not brushstroke, but see that pastel stroke repeated over and over again. It's clearly a drawing, but it's drawing with colored materials and mimicking the look of a painting. I think that poor redheaded girl on the left almost looks like she's hanging. The bow around her neck and the way her head is draped is a little peculiar here. The woman with the long red hair brushing or combing her hair. Look throughout the painting. The yellows and blues in the background, you see the marks through those. Degas was advised to draw many lines. He did so whether he was working on a painting or a drawing. And here's another pastel drawing by Degas called The Tub from 1886. Dates right around the same time as the previous pieces we looked at. And I think spatially this is another cool painting by Degas, in that you've got the ledge to the right that doesn't quite cut her off, but clearly is closer to us in space than the woman crouching in the tub. You've got her brush, perhaps her towel, and so on there on the ledge, the water pitcher. And those things are almost more in our space than in her space, so that it creates a great three-dimensional effect in the painting. Camille Pissarro lived until 1903, another Frenchman. He was a father figure of Impressionism. He took Cézanne and Gauguin under wing. He was kind of a mentor to both those painters. In the 1890s, he flirted with pointillism. He was associated briefly with Seurat. And what Cézanne said about Pissarro, I think, is very telling. He called him humble and colossal. That would be a wonderful thing to have said about you, that you're humble and colossal. Cézanne comes up with great nicknames for all of these Impressionists, doesn't he? Calling Monet an eye. Only an eye, but what an eye. Like Monet, Pissarro here does a painting of a haystack, but in this case I would say it's less about the light and more about the haystack, a little different from Monet's approach. This is from 1873, early on in the Impressionist movement. This is the Wheelbarrow from 1879. You see the color is a little more dramatic, a little brighter. Beautiful brush strokes. You see the marks all across the canvas. Even on the computer screen, it looks like this would be something that would be neat to run your hand over. Although you should never do something like that with a painting, particularly oil paintings. If you touch the surface of an oil painting, it usually causes it to crack, because when oil paint dries, it becomes very hard and very brittle. These paintings are very fragile. That's why the museum guards get so freaked out when you get close to one of these in the museum. Here's a self-portrait by Pissarro. Great ZZ top beard on the man. I think those comments that Cézanne made, you can kind of see in this painting. Humble and colossal. The painting himself looks like his eyebrows are kind of raised. Reference to his work on the back wall. Just a nice quick study. Not terribly unlike some of Rembrandt's quick studies that he did for portraits. A real tough thing to work with is snow in the landscape. You know, how much white can you put in a painting? But Pissarro does a great snow scene here, tints it with a little bit of blue, really gives it a brightness, some great violets in this painting and reds, and even hints of green in the foreground that make it more than just a boring white and gray and maybe a blue sky for a snow scene. What's great about the Impressionists is that they point out colors to us that are there, but that most people miss seeing on an everyday basis. Alfred Sisley was a French painter, but he was of English ancestry, and he died in 1899. He dealt almost exclusively with the theme of landscape, so he really fits in with the Impressionists in that manner. Very delicate touch and a beautiful feeling for tone in his work. And here's another snow scene that I think is very successful, like the Pissarro that we just looked at, although maybe a little less vibrant in terms of the color. I feel bad about some of the things I wrote about Sisley when I was in college. I kind of thought he was second rate at the time. But the more I look at his work, like that of Corot, I think this restrained palette and great touch and beautiful feeling for what he's painting really, really makes him an outstanding artist. Here are a couple more paintings by Sisley. Landscape on the left and another snow scene on the right. And you can see he does employ that Impressionist technique. You can definitely see the brushstrokes in both of these paintings, but not real loud with the color and not real bright with the color. He's kind of a quiet Impressionist, if you will. Now we come to Berthe Morisot, a French woman who lived until 1895. She was the great-granddaughter of Fragonard. Fragonard was a Rococo painter, and the Rococo period featured artists who painted the aristocracy at leisure in rich pastel hues. In other words, the rich at play in pretty colors. Sounds like a fairly disgusting theme to work into your art. She married Manet's younger brother, and she convinced Manet to try open-air painting and using brighter colors. If you recall, as we went through Manet's paintings, they went from darker to much brighter as he went along. And she painted domestic scenes and scenes with women and children in her paintings, like the one we see here. This first Morisot that we'll look at is called The Cradle from 1873. Remember when we were looking at the Greek sculpture and I talked about how beautiful the transparency of marble was on the Nike of Samothrace? Here I think there's great transparency with this cradle scene, and you see the netting come down, but you can still see the baby behind it. Great handling of the natural tendency of oil paints to be somewhat transparent. This painting to me has an odd title. It's called Eugene Manet and His Daughter. It was painted in 1881. Now, why is that title odd? It's odd to me because this is her husband and her daughter, and yet she titles it in this kind of detached manner. But great swirling brushstrokes. That sounds like something Robin would say to Batman. Great swirling brushstrokes, Batman. But great brushstrokes really animate this entire painting. Her husband looks out and doesn't really look at her. It's like he's looking at something that's going on behind her. I know when I paint my wife, I often have a TV set behind me to keep her attention and keep her head still. When I paint my mother, I have to sit close enough to her to give her a little nudge every now and then when she falls asleep. It's interesting, too, that she has her daughter turn away from her in this painting that is great in its contrasts of red and green. Here are two paintings called La Lecture that are both about reading. The one on the right outside or on a porch or on a patio. The one on the left inside. The one on the left definitely shows Manet's influence on Morisot. The one on the right shows Morisot's maybe more natural inclinations and certainly gives you a thought as to how Morisot would influence Manet in his paintings. Same theme, very different approaches, very different solutions. You decide which one you like best. Now, Mary Cassatt was an American, but I wouldn't really think of her as an American Impressionist because she spent her time in France with these French painters. She died in 1926. She was born to a wealthy family, and Degas admired her for her drawing skills. He thought she drew beautifully. Now, she made oils, pastels, and prints that were inspired by Japanese prints. And Gauguin said, Mary Cassatt has charm, but she also has force. Coming from Gauguin, that's quite a compliment. And we'll learn more about Gauguin in a later slideshow. Here is Mary Cassatt's painting called Lydia Crocheting in the Garden from 1880. And I think it's great with these red violets against the yellow greens. Beautiful play of complementary colors. Wonderful feeling for texture. Great brushstrokes on the woman's dress. Great brushstrokes in the background. It's almost like the Impressionists, when they do a portrait out of doors, can't decide whether they'd rather be painting the figure or the landscape. I think most of their sensibilities lie with the landscape. However, Mary Cassatt may be a little different in that respect. This is my favorite painting by Cassatt called The Bath from 1891. I just find the stripes on that woman's dress to be mesmerizing. They are so beautiful, and they really make this painting. Just think how easy it would be on the part of the artist to say, oh, those stripes are too much. I'm just going to simplify it and make it a solid color. How much would this painting suffer if you made that dress a solid color? Like we've seen with some other artists, you've got the picture in the foreground that is creating space. If it were large enough, you would almost feel like you could reach out, grab the picture, and pour some more water into the bath. Beautiful painting, beautiful execution, tender theme. It all works together. This is a fantastic image, one of the strongest of all the Impressionist paintings. So you can see Gauguin right here, his statement. She has charm and she has force, and I think both of them come across beautifully in this image called The Bath. This is called In the Loge, another painting by Cassatt where she's at the theater. And it's funny that she's not focusing on the action on the stage, but rather what's going on in the audience. And you immediately are drawn to the woman looking through her opera glasses at what's going on, holding her fan. But look off across the way, and there appears to be a man looking back at her. And so a wonderful little intrigue is set up in this painting called In the Loge by Mary Cassatt. Frederic Bazille was a Frenchman, died in 1870, fighting in the Franco-Prussian War. This is but the first example we'll see of many artists making bad soldiers. He came from a wealthy family. He gave financial support to Monet and Renoir, and he was primarily a figure painter. So that distances him a little bit from some of the other Impressionists. Here is Bazille's artist studio from 1870. Kind of large view of the artist studio. Not terribly unlike the Courbet that we looked at earlier in the semester, in that there's a fair amount of activity, a number of figures in the studio, yet the artist is still involved with his canvas. You've got somebody in the far right corner playing the piano. So music and the arts, we've seen references to literature before. All of these things go hand in hand. I like the man standing just in front of the painting. He looks like he's about 7 feet tall. What is it with these tall artists? Let's close with some quotes from the Impressionists. Manet said, "The artist simply seeks to be himself and no one else." Monet, "Try to forget what objects you have before you. Merely think, here is a little square of blue," perhaps followed by, "here is a little square of red." That's really a great description of the Impressionists' attitude and method of operation. Renoir, you gotta love this. "Paint with joy, with the same joy that you would make love to a woman." And Degas says, "Even when working from nature, one has to compose." In other words, you can't just walk outside and randomly choose something to look at and paint. You've got to think about what you're painting and how you place it on the canvas. And that closes our look at the Impressionists.